own thoughts, rather than being consumed by them. The moment you read that, the moment you understood that your brain is running a prediction model, something in you shifted slightly. That shift was Sophia waking up, not metaphorically, neurologically. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-reflection and metacognition, just activated in a new way. You stepped slightly outside your own automatic processing and observed it. That distance, even a millimeter of distance, is the beginning of everything. Now let's go deeper, because understanding the problem is only useful if you understand what made the problem invisible in the first place. The reason most people never question their perception filter is not stupidity, and it is not weakness. It is because the filter is designed to be invisible. A perception model that called attention to itself, would be a terrible survival tool. The whole point is that it runs silently, efficiently, in the background. Your brain is a prediction machine that also, by design, hides its own machinery. This means you can go your entire life feeling like your reactions are reasonable, your beliefs are accurate, and your perception of yourself is objective, while all of it is being shaped by a model you absorbed before you were old enough to read. Think about the version of you that exists in other people's minds. Your parents see you a certain way. Your colleagues see you differently. A stranger on the street forms an impression in under a second. Your oldest friend has a version of you built from years of shared history. Which of these is the real you? Now ask a harder question. Which version of yourself do you see? Because the answer to that last question determines almost everything. Your confidence, your relationships, your willingness to take risks, your experience of your own potential, all of it flows from the self-model your brain has constructed and continues to defend. Hermetic philosophy had a principle for this: know thyself. These two words, carved above the entrance to the oracle at Delphi, were not a warm invitation to explore your personality. They were a warning, a command. They were saying, before you attempt to understand anything else, before you attempt to shape your life, your relationships, your future, first understand the instrument through which you are experiencing all of it. Because if the instrument is distorted, everything seen through it will appear distorted, and the instrument, your perception, is distorted. Not because you are broken, because you are human, because you were shaped by forces that did not ask your permission. But here is the shift. Most people live their entire lives inside their model of reality without ever knowing the model exists. The moment you understand that the model exists, the moment you can name it, examine it, question it, you have crossed a threshold. You are no longer fully inside the veil. You are partially outside it. And partial clarity, when consistently practiced, becomes more clarity. And more clarity, over time, becomes something ancient traditions would have recognized as wisdom. The question is not whether you have a filter. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether you are going to let it run you invisibly or learn to see it, challenge it, and gradually rewrite it towards something more accurate, more expansive, and more aligned with who you actually are, rather than who you were taught to be. There is something that almost no one tells you about the process of becoming more self-aware, and the reason it doesn't get told is because it is uncomfortable to say and more uncomfortable to hear. When awareness begins to increase, the first thing it illuminates is not your potential. It is your patterns, not the inspiring patterns, the ones you would prefer to overlook, where you shrink in certain situations. The habit of seeking external validation before trusting your own judgment. The way old wounds create reactions that have nothing to do with the present moment. The stories you tell yourself about why you haven't done the things you know you want to do. Awareness, when it first arrives, is not peaceful. It is clarifying. And clarity, applied to the parts of ourselves we have spent years avoiding, can initially feel like a confrontation. This is the part of the spiritual journey that mystical content never shows. It shows the awakening, the expansion, the elevated state, but it skips the phase that almost every person goes through when genuine self-examination begins, the phase of productive discomfort, the phase where you see yourself more clearly and some of what you see is hard to accept. There is a reason psychology calls this process ego threat. Your sense of self, the continuous story your brain maintains about who you are and what you're capable of, is not just a concept, it is a survival structure. Your brain invests enormous resources in maintaining a consistent identity because consistency feels safe, predictable, navigable. When something challenges that identity, even something that would ultimately improve your life, the ego perceives it as a threat. This is why people know they have a bad habit and continue doing it. Why people stay in situations they know aren't right for them. Why people receive genuinely useful, feedback and immediately become defensive. The rational mind says, this information could help you. The ego says, this information contradicts the story I'm defending. And the ego usually wins, not because it is stronger, but because it operates unconsciously, and consciousness only intervenes when it has been trained to intervene. Ancient Gnostic philosophy had a remarkably precise description of this phenomenon. They spoke of what they called the archons, not literal beings, but internal forces that kept human consciousness locked in repetitive patterns, defending the familiar against the transformative. The archons were not evil in the traditional sense. They were simply the psychological mechanisms of self-preservation mistakenly applied to situations that no longer required preservation but required growth. When you feel resistance to change, that is not weakness. That is the archon principle in action. It is your nervous system prioritizing familiarity over expansion. It is your brain defending a model of reality that was once necessary and is now limiting. Here is what makes this particularly insidious. The patterns that limit us the most are usually the ones we are least aware of because they were formed earliest. The patterns formed in early childhood, when the nervous system is most sensitive and most plastic, are written into the architecture of the brain at a level deeper than memory. They don't feel like patterns. They feel like reality. They feel like personality. They feel like simply the way things are. This is why a person raised in an environment of emotional unpredictability can spend decades not recognizing why relationships feel difficult, not realizing that what they experience as other people being unpredictable is actually their own nervous system hypervigilant, scanning constantly for instability because it learned to expect it. This is why someone who was consistently told in childhood that they were too much, too sensitive, too ambitious, too loud, too needy can carry a story of self-diminishment for decades without knowing the story is there. They think they are being realistic. They don't realize they are running a program. The philosopher Carl Jung called these unconscious programs the shadow, not the evil side of personality, as popular culture misunderstands it, but the unexamined side. Everything you learn to hide, deny, suppress, or forget about yourself, not because it was truly dangerous, but because the environment around you was not safe enough to hold it. Sophia, as wisdom, has always represented the capacity to integrate the shadow rather than remain controlled by it, to bring the hidden patterns into light not through force, not through judgment, but through sustained, honest attention. And here is where it becomes practical, because this is not just psychological theory. This is a description of why your life looks the way it looks right now. Every area where you feel stuck, your finances, your relationships, your career, your health, there is a pattern operating beneath the surface. Not a punishment, not bad luck. A prediction model, built from old data, generating outcomes consistent with its own internal logic. A person whose nervous system learned that money creates conflict will unconsciously self-sabotage financial growth. Not because they want to be poor, but because the model says abundance equals conflict, and conflict is not safe. A person whose nervous system learned that emotional openness leads to rejection will build walls that feel like protection, but create the very loneliness they feared. A person whose nervous system learned that trying hard and still failing means fundamental inadequacy will either never truly try protecting themselves from confirming the worst story about themselves, or try and succeed and feel inexplicably empty because success didn't dissolve the underlying belief. This is not fate, this is architecture, and architecture can be redesigned. But redesigning it requires the very thing the ego resists most, seeing it clearly. This is why the Hermetic tradition placed such emphasis on self-examination as a daily practice, not a one-time event. Not because ancient teachers wanted their students to be perpetually introspective, but because they understood that unconscious patterns do not reveal themselves in a single moment of reflection. They reveal themselves gradually, through patient observation over time. Here is something you can start doing today, not as a spiritual practice, as a practical experiment. At the end of each day before you sleep, ask yourself 3 questions. Where did I react today in a way that felt disproportionate to the situation? What story was I telling about why that situation happened the way it did? And is there another interpretation of that situation that I'm not entertaining because it would require me to update something I currently believe? These 3 questions, asked with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, begin to reveal the architecture. They begin to create that crucial distance between you and your automatic patterns. And distance, even a small amount, is the beginning of choice. Because until you can observe a pattern, you cannot choose differently. You are simply inside it, believing it is reality. The moment you can observe it, even while still feeling its pull, you have a different relationship with it. You are no longer the pattern. You are the awareness noticing the pattern. And that awareness is Sophia, not floating above you, not separate from you. The clear intelligence that arises from within your own consciousness when you stop running on automatic long enough to look. Everything discussed so far is useful only if it moves from understanding into action. And action in the context of awareness is not dramatic. It is not a retreat, a purge, a radical life change. It is a quiet, consistent practice of building new mental, architecture while the old architecture is still running. This is where most transformation attempts fail. People experience insight and immediately try to change everything at once. New habits, new routines, new mindset, new environment, new identity, all simultaneously. The nervous system, overwhelmed by simultaneous change, snaps back to the familiar, and the person interprets this as failure rather than physiology. The brain does not change through intensity, it changes through repetition. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways, is not activated by dramatic decisions. It is activated by small, consistent behaviors that accumulate over time and gradually rewire the default patterns of response. Think of it this way. You have a river that has been carving a path through the same terrain for 20 years. That path is deep, well-worn, efficient. Water moves through it with almost no resistance. Now you want to redirect the river. You could try to immediately block the old channel and force all the water into a completely new direction. The pressure would be enormous, the resistance total, and within hours, the water would find its way back to the old path. Or you could begin a different process, start a small channel, a narrow groove in a new direction. Let some water begin moving through it while the old channel still runs. Gradually, over days and weeks and months, deepen the new channel, widen it, make it easier for water to flow through it, and eventually the new path becomes the path of least resistance. That is neuroplasticity. That is how the mind actually changes. So what does this look like practically? What are the channels worth carving? The first one is the most fundamental and the most underestimated: deliberate silence. Not meditation necessarily, not any formal practice. Simply silence. Each day for a minimum of 5 to 10 minutes, removing all external input and allowing your mind to do whatever it does without trying to direct, fix, or escape it. Most people never do this. Most people fill every available moment of quiet with some form of stimulation music, podcasts, scrolling, television, conversation. Not because they love the stimulation, but because silence is uncomfortable. And silence is uncomfortable because in silence you hear your mind. And when you hear your mind clearly for the first time in a long time, what you often hear is disorganized, repetitive, and sometimes distressing. But here is what those same people don't know. The discomfort of silence is not the silence itself. The discomfort is the pressure of unprocessed experience. Thoughts and emotions that have been accumulating beneath the noise, waiting for a moment quiet enough to surface. When you finally sit in silence, they surface, and that initial surfacing can feel overwhelming. But if you stay, if you don't immediately reach for the phone or the music, something remarkable begins to happen. The thoughts exhaust themselves. The emotions move through and discharge, and beneath the noise there is a quality of awareness that is neither troubled nor exciting. It is simply present, clear, stable. Ancient traditions called this the ground of awareness, the silent field within which all experience arises and passes, and the practice of touching this field, even briefly each day, begins to create a kind of internal stability that no external circumstance can fully disturb. This is not a mystical claim. Neuroscience has documented the measurable effects of regular periods of mental stillness on the prefrontal cortex, on emotional regulation, on the default mode network's tendency to run anxious or self-critical narratives. The brain that regularly encounters stillness becomes structurally different from the brain that never does. The second channel worth carving is what could be called the pause practice. It is extraordinarily simple and extraordinarily difficult. Between stimulus and response, there is a gap. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and became one of the most important psychologists of the 20th century, wrote that the discovery of that gap was the discovery of human freedom. In the most extreme possible conditions, he found that no external force could take away a person's ability to choose their response to what was happening. The pause is the practice of finding that gap and gradually widening it. Every time something happens, a frustrating message, an unexpected problem, a person who irritates you, an opportunity that triggers fear, your nervous system moves toward an automatic response. That response was written by your history, not by the present moment. The pause is a 3 to 5 second deliberate interruption of that automatic response. You do not suppress the feeling. You do not pretend the stimulus didn't happen. You simply breathe, observe what is arising in your body and mind, and then choose your response, rather than execute it automatically. At first, this will feel artificial and forced. That is how all new neural pathways feel effortful and slightly awkward, like walking on unfamiliar terrain. But over time, the pause becomes natural, and the quality of your responses to people, to situations, to your own thoughts begins to change in ways that compound. Relationships improve not because the people in them change, but because you stop responding to them through the distortion of old patterns. Decisions improve not because your intelligence increases, but because you stop deciding from fear, obligation, or habit, and start deciding from considered intention. Your experience of your own life improves not because your circumstances become perfect, but because you are no longer constantly at the mercy of automatic reactions to imperfect circumstances. The third channel is what might be called narrative examination. This is slightly more advanced, but it is where the deepest change occurs. Every day your brain is telling you stories. Stories about who you are. Stories about what other people think of you. Stories about why things happened the way they did. Stories about what the future holds. These stories feel like observations. They feel like simply noticing what is true. But they are interpretations, and interpretations can be challenged. The practice is this. When you notice a strong negative emotion, instead of immediately reacting to it or suppressing it, ask a single question. What story am I telling right now that is generating this feeling? Your colleague didn't respond to your message and you feel anxious. The story is probably something like, they are ignoring me, which means I did something wrong, which confirms something I already fear about myself. But that is one interpretation of one data point. The actual data point is, a message was sent and has not yet received a reply. Your business idea didn't work out and you feel like a failure. The story is probably something like, this confirms that I don't have what it takes, that success is for other people, that trying was foolish. But the actual data point is, one approach did not produce the desired result on this timeline. The story generates the emotion. The emotion feels like reality. And when emotion feels like reality, you stop questioning it and start acting from it. Narrative examination interrupts this chain, not by replacing negative stories with false positive ones that is called toxic positivity, It makes things worse, not better, but by recognizing that a story is a story, not a fact. And once you recognize it as a story, you can ask, is this the only interpretation available? Is this interpretation actually supported by the evidence? And if I held a different interpretation, what might become possible? This is the practical engine of what mystics called the return to Sophia, not a spiritual experience, a cognitive skill, the skill of observing your own mind's narrative process rather than being automatically driven by it. Now let's talk about the integration timeline, because this is where most people need honesty rather than inspiration. Real neural change, the kind that holds, the kind that becomes the new default, rather than the exceptional state, does not happen in a week. The research on neuroplasticity consistently points to timeframes of 3 to 8 weeks for initial pathway formation and 3 to 6 months for pathways to become the new default. This is not discouraging. This is liberating. It means there is a reliable process. It means that if you practice these 3 things: deliberate silence, the pause, and narrative examination consistently for 90 days, you will be measurably, demonstrably different from who you are today. Not in personality, not in fundamental nature, but in the quality of your perception, the clarity of your thinking, and your capacity to choose your responses rather than be driven by automatic reactions. The ancient people, traditions who spoke in terms of 40-day practices, 21-day initiations, 90-day integration periods, they were not inventing magic numbers. They were describing what observation had taught them about the actual timeline of human psychological change. There is one more thing that needs to be said, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire video. You will regress. There will be days, weeks, even when the old patterns reassert themselves fully. When the filter returns with its full force. When you react automatically, tell the old stories, lose the pause, and feel like everything you've built has collapsed. This is not failure. This is the nature of change in a biological system. Neural pathways do not rewire in a straight line. They rewire in spirals, moving forward, then circling back, moving forward again, circling back from a slightly different position. The people who sustain genuine long-term transformation are not the people who never regress. They are the people who, when they find themselves back in the old pattern, do not interpret that as proof that change is impossible. They interpret it as data. They observe, here is the old architecture reasserting itself. They return to the practice silence, pause, narrative examination without drama and without self-judgment. Self-judgment is the enemy of change. Every moment you spend criticizing yourself or regressing is a moment you are running the old architecture harder. The fastest path back to clarity is not self-punishment. It is simply returning to presence without ceremony. Sophia, in the deepest interpretation of the Gnostic tradition, is not a being that appears to the spiritually advanced. She is the quality of awareness that returns always when you stop running, stop defending, and simply observe what is actually here. She is not absent during the regressions. She is what you find when you stop running from them. You have just spent more concentrated attention on one piece of content than most people will spend all week on anything that isn't designed to addict them. That is not a small thing. The world you live in is engineered at extraordinary scale and sophistication to capture your attention and fragment it. Every platform, every algorithm, every notification system is optimized for one thing: keeping you in a state of partial engagement, never fully present, always slightly distracted, perpetually reaching for the next thing. This is not conspiracy, it is economics. Fragmented attention is monetizable attention. Present, clear, sovereign attention is difficult to influence and difficult to sell to. When you chose to stay present through this video, you made a small but real act of reclamation. You took your attention back from the fragment machine and directed it deliberately towards something that asks you to think, to examine, to consider. That act repeated is how perception changes, not through a single insight, through the habit of returning, to presence. Here is the only thing I will ask of you. Do not let this be inspiration that evaporates by tomorrow. Inspiration without integration is just entertainment in a more elevated costume. Choose one practice. 1. Deliberate silence for 5 minutes today. The pause the next time you feel triggered. One question asked honestly about one story you've been telling yourself. Just one. Consistently for 30 days. And then observe what has shifted. If this video reached something in you, if it named something you've been sensing but couldn't articulate, share it with someone you care about who you think is ready for it. Not to seem enlightened, because the people who encounter this kind of thinking at the right moment are often looking for exactly this and don't know where to find it. Leave a comment with one word, not present, not a buzzword. One honest word describing what this brought up for you. Because comments written from genuine reflection rather than performance create a different kind of conversation, and that conversation is worth having. Subscribe if you want more of this. Not polished performance, grounded, research-backed exploration of consciousness, perception, identity, and the practical question of how to live more deliberately in a world that profits from your distraction. The signal was not something broadcast at you from outside. The signal was your attention, the decision to stay. And that signal is yours. Entirely, permanently, no one can. People, take it back, unless you give it away again. Don't give it away cheaply.
I personally researched, wrote and prepared this video to prong your accurate and meaningful content. Subscribe for more original content.
Oh, thank you. Wow, that was beautiful.